Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes while people get logged on. Good morning. We're just waiting for people to log on. We'll start in just a few minutes. Give it one more minute. Let a couple more people sign on. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Napa Valley Grape Growers' second winter roundtable on economic strategies and farm planning for the new normal. I'm Emily Hegarty. I'm the program director for the Napa Valley Grape Growers and Farm Worker Foundation. Some housekeeping notes before we begin. All attendees are muted right now. However, in the style of a true roundtable, we will be giving all attendees the opportunity to ask live questions by using the raise hand function on the participants tab. So you can see that circled in purple right in the middle. Following the speakers' presentations, we'll announce a Q&A portion of the webinar, and we will be happy to call on participants whose Zoom hands are raised one by one. When we call your name, we will unmute you and you can ask your question. And if you're not up for a little live question, you may also enter a question at any time through the Q&A box during the presentation, and that you can see in the orange circle. Please note there's also a chat feature, but we ask that you reserve that for any technical difficulties that you might have. A couple more MVG announcements. We will be doing PPE pickups tomorrow at the MVG office between 9 and 5 p.m. We'll be handing out cloth masks. And additionally, you can find our winter membership update for both organizations on our website. This is a great hub for you to find all upcoming events, review our 2020 annual report, and see what we have planned for this winter. Lastly, we ask that you please remember to fill out the survey at the end of today's event. So when you log off your Zoom, a little browser will pop up on your screen asking you to complete that. And we ask that you give your feedback just so that we can continue to provide programs and services that are of value to you. So with that, today we are happy to welcome our speakers, Garrett Buckland, partner at Premier Viticultural Services, and Justin Legion, viticulturist at Pena Vineyard Management. Garrett was a past president of the Napa Valley Grape Growers, and through Premier Vit, he consults with more than 40 high-end vineyard and winery clients and works with over 1,500 acres in the Napa Valley. And Justin has been working almost 20 years in the wine industry and is responsible for overseeing all aspects of high-end wine grape farming, as well as vineyard development at Pena Vineyard Management. So needless to say, you are in good hands with these two. And with that, I will let Garrett take it away.
Great, thank you, Emily. Welcome, everybody. As Emily mentioned, a little bit about my business. I work mostly with estate wineries and a handful of growers that sell fruit as well, and have been in this business for a long time here in Napa. I think the topic that we're about to cover today is certainly very timely. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, a lot of challenges behind us, of course, and more to come in 2021 and the next few years. So with this, I want to kind of keep this a little bit open. Some of this is obviously going to be things that a lot of you already know and are incorporating in your business, but I want to make sure that we can talk about them as a group here and work on some strategies for being successful in the future. Okay, Great, I've got control of the screen here. So everybody take a deep breath. This concept of the new normal is something that I really hate using that term. 2020, certainly arguably the most awful year, if we can think of one, in virtually every aspect you can imagine. Started out with some very regressive kind of tariffs on wine that started us in a bit of a tailspin on the supply side. Slump in grape demand. COVID-19 hit us early in March, as we're all well aware. Complete shutdown of our restaurant and tasting room business. Near zero tourism for the entire season. And the biggest fires we've seen, certainly by acreage, in the last however many years. Near hottest temperatures we've ever seen. We had 117.5 degrees on Labor Day weekend. Just in the middle of all the other chaos happening. Absolutely awful year for smoke taint. And another absolutely devastating fire, the glass fire. People lost their crop, their properties, their houses, their belongings. I just want to take a quick minute here. There's some people on this call who really did have an awful time during those fires, and our hearts go out to you on that. Hopefully you're getting back on your feet at the moment. No real rainfall to speak of this winter. We have some coming this next week, which should be great. Crop insurance and grape contracting issues, absolutely, a mess right now. If you're dealing with this from a purchasing standpoint or a grape sales standpoint, more COVID-19, of course, significant wage and hour changes that have been implemented, some that are coming, looming debt and a seemingly dark economic horizon could be in the future. And then, of course, increased regulation and regulatory oversight kind of coming at us from every single direction as growers and wineries. These are things that are hard to get a handle on what's going to happen, but we can see any agency with a few letters in its name seems to want to take a look at what we do in Napa County, certainly in the grape growing world, and have a little bit of input and oversight that leads to a lot of complexity and some big hoops to jump through. We did dodge a pretty large bullet for property tax changes, and some of those passed as well. But there's a ton of things that happened in 2020 that certainly we want to leave behind us, and hopefully they don't become the new normal. So take a deep breath. Let's see if we can get the next slide here. Emily, can you get that? There you go. So it is all tremendously overwhelming. The good news is that we're all NVG members, and we will definitely get through this together. There's a lot of resources that we have planned for this year in helping you with your business, and certainly things like contracting, learning about leasing, other things that are on the plate for seminars this year should be really fantastic. One of the things that we're most worried about as we talk about how do we build really good businesses that are sustainable and can really work for us. Volatility is one of the biggest things that gets in the way of that. As farmers, we're always worried about this. We're worried about market volatility. What is the market for our crop? We're worried about consumer changes in consumer taste, changes in consumer buying habits, economic volatility. If people don't have any money, they can't buy our grapes and wine. And then, of course, the ever-present changes in weather and climate are something that we all need to be thinking about over the next 30-year horizons of our properties and our vineyards. As I mentioned, that regulatory piece, it seemingly there's always something new that's going to, potentially get in the way of our long-term stability that comes as a regulatory piece, and it's something we always need to be reacting to. This increased volatility leads to increased risk. And as good farmers, we know that our number one goal is to produce a marketable crop while minimizing risk. And to be successful in this new decade, we're going to have to think seriously about really great tools to reduce risk. So what does that mean for me? If you're a grower on this call, We need to start thinking about, how are we operating our business to be successful? Who do we sell to? What is our business? Are we selling our fruit to ultra premium wineries? Are we selling our fruit to kind of more blue chip wineries? Are we taking a gamble on startup brands, or are we firmly rooted in kind of the commodity market? These are things that I ask growers all the time, kind of where do you want to be with your vineyard? And we hear things, all over the map. Some people just want to sell their fruit and make a little bit of money. Some people want to really make a mark and grow the best fruit they can. Other people are just looking to make sure they have clients that pay their bills. These are things that we really need to take a very close look at and figure out where you want to position your vineyard to. I always recommend that it's important to kind of take a gamble, maybe not with your entire business, but gamble on a startup or two. Sometimes young winemakers can have a lot of drive and ambition and can really showcase your vineyard. So it's always nice to work with them. And some of them don't work out, and sometimes they can't pay their bills, but we start to forge some pretty good relationships and help grow with a winery or a winemaker that can put your vineyard on the map and maybe make 100-point wine and do some single vineyard type of things. It's important to really look back and say, well, what do we excel at? What are we good at? And what type of market should we focus on? I like spreading grape sales amongst several clients at a time. Oftentimes you may have a 20-acre vineyard where you sell 3 or 4 truckloads of fruit to one particular client. If that relationship goes south, or if that business gets sold or something like that, it leaves us in a pretty strange position, having to move all of our fruit at once. Spreading grape sales among multiple clients can tend to be a headache, but it's a really great way to reduce risk and not being stuck with a lot of unsold fruit. Wineries always remember growers that are willing to work with them when the going gets tough. 2020 showed us one thing in particular, is that really great relationships can keep business going, even when we have the most disastrous of events that put us both on the winery and the vineyard side in a very awkward position. So it's important to build these strong relationships and come to the table and really talk about what works for both parties. I think you'll often find there's a welcome ear, and the people that work with you are the people you want to deal with in the future. Always important to stagger contract end dates and start considering maybe some acreage contracts. These are great ways to reduce your risk and not get stuck in a down market. One thing we talked about in a prior seminar earlier this year is maybe consider growing multiple varieties. There's still an opportunity to graft over to different varieties this year, kind of spread out your risks. Specifically, as we talk about fire, having a white grape, which might be ripe a little bit early, you certainly maybe can't make the return per acre that you're looking for, but having a small portion of your vineyard to that really spreads out the work, spreads out the time, and spreads out the risk. Is in-house farming right for you? Using a management company or some sort of hybrid model? These are questions that we should always be asking ourselves. What is the most efficient way for me to farm my vineyard? Is it important to have your own staff? Is there a story that you're telling with that as well? Is it all about being as efficient as possible? These are questions that need to get answered and need to be looked at under a fresh lens. Especially as we have a lot of dynamic changes in wage and hour laws and complexity with HR and all sorts of other things that come with having your own crews. Should I start producing my own wine? This is something that a lot of people have been asking over the past few years. It's not for everybody, obviously, but this is an area for you to start getting into sort of longer time horizons for your own product. Some people go down the rabbit hole of this and come out the other end and say that was a bad idea. If you're committed to making your own wines, there are certainly ways to really start that and work with professionals to get that going. Should I think about that? I think every single property owner as a grower, everybody in this business has probably thought about it at one point or another, starting their own brand. And it's not for everybody, but it is something that every business should probably consider. We do want to start succession planning very early. If anything told us with the most recent ballot initiatives for property tax changes and things like that, not having a very good plan, or at least not having a process to exit this business and leave it to your family, is something that can catch people off guard. We do want to be developing a very robust farming strategy and execute vineyard activities flawlessly to stand out. This is something that most Napa Valley growers do incredibly well, but there's always an opportunity to improve. Strategy is just one piece of the puzzle. If we don't have the pieces in place to execute vineyard activities, we miss the mark. We have a lot of really tough time, building the best vineyard that we can and the best quality that we can. For pretty much every vineyard operation, there's a perfect window of about 2 weeks to execute on. And if we miss that, some cases, it's not even worth doing that activity at all. As you build new vineyards or retrofit old vineyards, it's really important to consider adding all the bells and whistles to that. Think about future-proofing your vineyard. This is something that we talk a lot about to help hedge against this variability in climate and sort of everything moving forward. Building a more flexible vineyard is incredibly important. And that's things like consider a misting system, consider heat suppression tools, build your vineyard with double poly. All of the things that you may not have considered were very important 20 years ago are extremely important as you build a vineyard into the next decade here. And then most importantly, we've got to get crop insurance. Everybody knows that crop insurance this year was incredibly valuable and something that, it may not seem like it pays off, but when we get a catastrophic year, we really want to have that. So as a grower, we should really be thinking about some of the steps here to really reduce our risk and spread out our activities. Next slide. Let's see. If you're a winery, I'm not going to go through this list, but basically everything is exactly the same that I just said in reverse. We want to think about who we actually buy fruit from. If you are a winery that purchases fruit, we should be looking to match our grower relationships with the style of our wines and the price point of our wines. Nothing gets in the way of a good relationship, worse than not having the same end goals. And a vineyard that's designed for building commodity products that aren't quite making it into an ultra premium wine is a recipe for disaster. So certainly curating the vineyards that we buy from and building those relationships is incredibly important. And last year showed us a lot of really stable things that we thought we had as wineries and growers. We realized that they weren't so good. So building and forging that relationship and being on the same page is incredibly important. Another thing that wineries are talking about at this point is, should we be thinking about growing more of our own supply? Should we be thinking about, hedging our costs a little bit to not be stuck to kind of the Napa Valley average or fluctuations in grape supply. And that's something that each individual winery is positioned to do very differently. In some cases, purchasing property is very easy for some wineries, and a lease or something like that might be an easier way to get into the growing of your own supply. Oftentimes, when we are growing our own supply as wineries, we can moderate our cost of goods a little bit better than you might find on the open market. And that's something that every business should take this time during the winter time to start thinking about the 5 and 10 and 15-year plan for vineyard ownership, as well as grape purchasing. Next slide. Oh yeah, and get crop insurance. I wanted to do this exercise for all different aspects of our business. And one of the big ones is actually a vineyard management company. And you guys are sadly on your own for that one. Sorry about that. So no tips and pointers, except for what's happening with vineyard management companies today is really acute issues with labor, with changes in labor, with changes in overtime and hour wages and things like that. These are things that management companies are dealing with on a regular basis, and certainly as they work with individual properties and companies, you're going to see some costs increase over the next few years. These are things that everybody is actively looking to reduce. In some cases, that's looking for H2A labor, that's looking to mechanize whatever you can, that's looking to really spread out our workflow over the entire season with different varieties, working with some Chardonnay, working with some Sauvignon Blanc, working with some Cabernet to really keep the peak work hours down. Management companies are really good at this, and it's certainly great to reach out to them if anybody needs any pointers. Next slide. Now, let's say you're a landowner not directly involved in farming operations. This is a tricky position to be in. A lot of people we work with at this point in time are really kind of, a little bit removed from the farming operation, and maybe working with a management company to do sort of all of their farming. It's really important, if you're in this situation, to work closely with your management company to align your expectations. Oftentimes, we're working with people that might have different skill sets. Working with very high-end properties may not translate very well to keeping costs low in a commodity situation, and vice versa. And so don't be afraid to reach out to your management company and have these conversations about not just budgeting, but where are they really good at, and what types of things can we execute on and work well, and what are their strong points. Costs are ever increasing, and nobody likes surprises. So that important dialogue between a management company and yourself will keep some of that at bay. Just a side note, as we talk in the roundtable a little bit later, it'd be great to hear from people who are on the management company side. We're certainly expecting, increases 5%, a year, at least 5-10% a year over the past few years, as we start to normalize some of our wage and hour changes to overtime hours and things like that. I'd like to bring that up in the questions for other people on the call. It's okay to demand more from your vineyard managers. They're a tremendously talented group of people in our business, and quite a few capable management companies that can deliver to your expectations. But don't be afraid to have that conversation with them. Always important to understand that landowners really share liability for anyone working on their property, whether that's an internal employee or somebody from an outside company. Sometimes we think about ways to kind of shortcut the system, and that's always not the case here. We do carry joint liability for anybody working on our properties. Always important, if you're in this category, to be very careful of the kind of weekend farmers. As we look to really reduce costs in the vineyard, a lot of people might be doing some work on the side. It's important to remember that management companies need to be licensed farm labor contractors in order to do any agricultural work for hire. The state is cracking down on this quite a bit, and I would hate for anybody to find themselves at risk here. Always important to review NVG's best practices for choosing a vineyard management company. This should be posted on the website, and it's a really great white paper about some of the things that you should look closely at when choosing a good partner to farm your property. More and more people are exploring lease options, and if you're interested in spending a little bit less time with your vineyard, this might actually be something that would work for you. Allows you to really keep the property in your family and keep it with a small, generally stable income coming in. Leasing with the right partners can often work for a lot of situations. There's also plenty of bad leases and things that, after 25 years, everybody parts ways and is very bitter. I can't stress enough that before you decide to do something like leasing your vineyard, really do the due diligence to find a partner who's going to respect your property and leave you with a valuable asset at the end of your relationship. If you are replanting, we should always be focusing on future-proofing our vineyards. This is something that Justin's going to talk a little bit about in our next presentation here, but building the vineyard of the future, building something that is going to reduce our risk over the next 30 years is incredibly important. Think about equipment, mechanization, climate variability, and design that vineyard to check all those boxes. There are a lot of things that we've learned over the past 30 years as we look to replanting new vineyards here that we should be incorporating in every one of our operations. Smart farming decisions will definitely make your property more marketable and valuable over the long run. And so I encourage everybody to work with professionals that have the best eye for your property and your asset. And then of course, always get crop insurance. Next slide. So just to wrap it up here, what should we all be considering as we go into this next season? This is an important time for us to really double down on our operation. Vineyards and brands that don't really take this opportunity to rebuild and renew will probably find themselves not surviving over the next few years. Always important to consider branding your vineyard. What makes you special to your clientele? Is that a single vineyard? Is that being somebody's go-to for kind of this commodity level pricing? What is that relationship that makes it really special to the people that you're selling to? And find out what that is and really double down your efforts to make that important. Always market with your wine partners. This is something that a lot of people tend to overlook. There's a huge amount of missed opportunities for wineries that buy fruit from properties to not showcase their growers, and vice versa. Growers that sell fruit to wineries should really be out in the marketplace and offer up your support to help them with efforts on their sales. Build incredibly strong relationships with wine or fruit buyers. I unfortunately saw a lot of really great relationships fall apart in 2020 over smoke taint issues and things like that. The really successful ones were people that met in the middle and came to the table. I can't stress this enough. As we look to build good relationships over the next 10, 15 years with the people in our industry, we need to be thinking about shoes on the other feet and understanding what both sellers and buyers need out of a good relationship. We should always be maintaining or improving our farming at every operation. We need to be thinking about what is that ideal timing, what is the most sustainable, what's the best for my wine quality. And then of course, always hire professionals to help you make smart decisions where you might be deficient in that area. We have a tremendous amount of NVG seminars and talks planned for this year. I would encourage everybody to attend as many as they can. Great opportunity to network with potential buyers. Hopefully one of these days we'll be back in person to do that. And certainly get involved locally, get involved from a regulatory standpoint. Head off trouble before it's at your doorstep is incredibly important to do. Always great to build a 5, 10, or a 30-year plan. I'm always shocked at how few people in our business, either on the winery side or the vineyard side, don't quite know where they want to be in 5 years, let alone 10 or 30. I ask this question all the time, and I'm not quite sure why we don't have more people doing this, but a really solid plan is your roadmap for the next generation of farmers here in Napa. And most of all, stay positive. We've weathered tough times before here in Napa, and hopefully 2021 and 2022 and 2023 are going to be much better. I think we'll go ahead and save questions maybe for the end, but at this point, we're going to turn it over to Justin Legan, who's going to talk a little bit more about if you're considering a replant or a new planting, some really important things for you to focus on to be successful. Thank you.
Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, that was great. So, one of the things that I think we run into when we're looking at planning and prepping for redevelopment, whether it's new development or it's something that's already existing, is creating a timeline and understanding the expectations of that timeline, and really understanding where things fall into place and what order things need to be done in, especially with the county and with regulations. So I think that's just an extremely important thing to keep in your mind at all times. So I would say that the first place to start, is looking at whether or not you have an erosion control plan, an ECP, and whether or not you're going to need to get a track 1, which would be new development, or a track 2. In most cases, what we're talking about today would be the track 2 for redevelopment. And the timeline for that right now is about 4 to 6 months or so to get it approved through the county. Track 1s it's at least a couple of years right now, probably about 2 years. So the first step, is talking to your engineer. Hopefully you guys have already got ECPs in place, and you kind of have familiarity of what's on those plans and what needs to be done in the process of redevelopment. So what I've kind of been thinking about how the best way to go through this would be, and I'm just going to sort of imagine, we're out walking a vineyard, and these are the steps that we're going to go through, and just sort of go through the process so that you guys have some familiarity with it. I think a lot of you probably already understand a lot of this pretty well, but just to kind of recap and go through it so that maybe there aren't any surprises. So the first step, the ECP, and then the second step would be soil tests. You want to get test pits done to understand what types of amendments you're going to be looking at. The big 3 tend to be compost, gypsum, or lime, and some combination of those. There are other ones, but those are definitely going to be the main ones in Napa. We're blessed to have very very high nitrogen soils that allow us to really get the plants going without a lot of need on that end. So that's really beneficial. And those amendments, it's important to get those on site and have them ready for when the groundwork's going to be done. Again, going back to the erosion control plan, you're going to be able to see sort of when you can do that. I guess I should back up one step. If you don't have over a 5% slope in your vineyard, then you won't need an erosion control plan. Nowadays, it just seems like most of the development that's being done is on something sloped. So I just kind of tend to assume that. But if you're under 5%, then you don't need to worry about the erosion control plan. And then the timeline is much more based around the weather, Mother Nature, and whether or not the ground's too wet to get in and do some of the things that you want to do. So when we're looking at that timeline, I like to recommend, year 1 is pulling and prepping, and then year 2 would be planting, and you can put in the trellis either in the fall before planting, or in winter or spring before planting. But getting all of that groundwork done and getting the soil prepped to the point where you're going to have the best chance of success, I think is extremely important. And having that timeline and expectations of when things are going to happen is really important in that process. So getting the amendments ordered, getting all the test results from your soil in, and reading through there and seeing what you need. Those test pits can be done by companies that you can hire, consultants that will generate really great lab reports, give you ideas of where your pH is and whether or not you need lime to raise that pH. Whether or not you need gypsum for soil structure to improve the tilth of the soil. Just all the ins and outs of that, and where you want to be to get that soil, in the best shape it can be. Because the opportunity we have when we do redevelopment is really great, because if the trellis is removed and you can really get in and work the ground, that's your best shot to really make those amendments and make them work for you. It's much more difficult down the road to go back once the trellis is in and the vines are there to improve soil. So this is a great time to do that. And we always like to say, do it right. This is the time when you have that opportunity. It's going to be hopefully for the life of the vineyard, at least 30 years, and you can really benefit a lot from that. So, take the time and make sure that you're doing all the things that you think need to be done. Drainage might be necessary. So again, this would be sort of that time frame of when you're going to be doing that work. And those soil pits will let you know whether or not you need drainage. You can get a really good look at the different horizon levels. You could see whether or not you've got anaerobic conditions and maybe ripping depth, all that stuff, and how you want to rip, or if you want to use a plow, or all the different methods you can use to break up the ground will come from those test pits. So that's, I think, the place you want to start. is really get a good understanding of your soil, understand where the variability is, and redevelopment is a great opportunity to change some of those block shapes, and really match it to the soil and allow you to have your grapes grow more uniformly. We always want to have, as Garrett mentioned, we're always going to want to have a second valve for double poly for the weak areas, or just to be able to irrigate in smaller sections. But if we can match that to the soil from the get-go, that really puts us miles ahead. So something that you definitely want to keep in the back of your mind. And just one note on lime, there are two different types of lime. You have the dolomite or dolomitic lime, which is going to have some magnesium in it. And then, the calcitic lime is just the straight lime. And so that's something that you'll get from your report. But if anybody had any questions about that and kind of what the differences are. So after we've got our test pits done, we've got a report, we're going to look at what are we going to plant, right? What kind of rootstock do we want? What's the clone? What's the market demanding, and what's my site best at growing? And those vine contracts that you're going to get with the nursery need to be done well in advance. And so we always recommend, order your plant material as early as possible, get on the first rotation. Your best chance of success is to get, the cleanest plant material possible and have it ordered as early as possible. I prefer dormant bench grafts. They, can get in the ground earlier, warm up with the soil, they get a whole season of growth. Whereas your green potted plants or green growers typically are a little later, and the root system's not as old and established. But we can go both ways. But my preference is dormant bench grafts, which you're really going to want to have those orders in by August of this year for planting in 2022. And then for green growers, typically by November, you're going to want to have those orders in for planting more late spring, summertime of 2022. And with green growers, one thing to keep in mind is just what the water needs are going to be. They're going to be different than bench grafts. Dormant bench grafts, they're going to have an older root system, warm up with the soil, and have a little bit better establishment. Whereas a green potted plant, you're putting in the ground typically in May or June or even July, and it's the hottest time of year. And so looking at what the water needs are is really important. I typically like to shoot for, in a perfect world, 6 gallons a week on those vines in those hottest months. Let's say 4 or 5 months in the middle of the year. That could be 2 gallons 3 times a week. It could be 3 gallons twice a week, whatever. But to get that 6 gallons a week, it's pretty high demand for water in the summertime. So those are calculations I think that need to be made, before going down, the ordering path and understanding what kind of rootstock you need, the drought tolerance, and all those things that you can get from your report and from some consultants. And talk to your winemakers. Get the best information you can from people that you trust. And there's a lot of options out there on which rootstocks to plant. Sometimes you might not have as many choices because of pest pressure, which would show up as well when you're doing nematode testing. But there's a lot of versatility there. We're blessed that we have great rootstocks to choose from that can produce ultra premium grapes. And for the most part, there's going to be 2 or 3 that are going to be a good match for your soil. And understanding, which one you're going to want to go with is really important. And then the last kind of step with prepping and planting is your frost protection. Sprinklers are always going to be better in terms of protection against frost, but they're not always possible. Oftentimes they're not feasible with what your water availability is or cost, or a whole bunch of different reasons for why that won't work. So wind machines also are an option. That's something that needs to be looked at as, what's the slope of the land and where is the cold air going to settle, and how do I want to address that? So those are things to understand when you're looking at, when you're putting in a new vineyard, what are the water needs going to be? There's new regulations coming next year, I would imagine, where we're going to have some pretty strict requirements, I think, on groundwater use, on wells. And so make sure that you're putting in meters and you're doing all your due diligence and understanding if you need a well. We always recommend now's the time, because you don't know down the road if it's going to be a possibility. So if we go to the next slide, once we've got, the soil pits done, we've got the land, our understanding of the land is better, and we know what types of amendments we need. You know, that year one, we've spread the amendments, ripped them in, gotten everything ready to go. We're going to want to look at what type of trellis design we're going to want. And a lot of that's going to be dictated by what rootstock is chosen and what cultivar is being grown. I like to view the tractor row and the vine spacing as somewhat separate. I think tractor row is really important, like Garrett mentioned, to understand what type of equipment you're going to be using and what type of cultivation, if you're going to be doing that, and the size of the tractor that you're going to need to be getting down those rows. My own just sort of personal philosophy is I'd love to see nothing ever tighter than 8 feet. That would be fantastic as a farmer. I think it's possible that we can grow great grapes at that width. But if you're going to go tighter than that, it will impact what kind of cross arms you can use. And the cross arm, plant spacing, row orientation all kind of work together. So as you maybe you tweak one of those factors, it's going to adjust another one. And so they all sort of have to be considered together as a whole. And if you're looking at your row orientation first, that can kind of give you an idea of what type of exposure you're going to have in the afternoon or in the morning, and allow you to understand, okay, can I go tighter? If I go, 24 degrees off north with Cabernet Sauvignon, maybe I can go a little tighter with my cross arms. If I'm going to be going, let's say, more than 35 degrees off north, okay, now I've got a totally different exposure on the afternoon side or the north side, so I need more of a sprawl or a V. And those are things that we need to look at, because if you have 6 foot row spacing, and then you try and put in a 24-inch cross arm in the top, and then now you can't get the tractor through, they all need to fit well together. So the other thing I think that's important to think about with plant spacing is the idea that, we probably have a target of, let's say, 3.5 tons per acre or 4.5 tons per acre, or if it's Sauvignon Blanc, maybe it's more like 7 or 8 tons per acre. And the last thing we want to do is design a vineyard where we're going to have to go through and drop half the fruit on the ground every year, and not necessarily for quality purposes, but just because of where the yield's at and what we're looking at and what the demand is in the market. So I think that we can do, a really good job at, say, going, 8 by 4 or even 8 by 3 or 9 by 4, whatever, however you want to mix it up to get, let's say, a vines per acre count that's going to allow you to get your pounds per plant that you want without having to go through and drop everything on the ground, and have to suffer through that every year, where, some places you need to do it. It's just part of what we need to do in Napa to make ultra premium wine. But there's other cases where I think we could design a vineyard a little differently to lessen that burden and have less fruit removal that's needed down the road. Just as sort of a quick calculation, just for reference, let's say we want 3.5 tons per acre, and I want 5 pounds per vine. Let's say that's just the number, the magic number that we've decided is where we want to be. So 3.5 tons per acre, 7,000 pounds per acre, and I want 5 pounds per vine. Well, I need 1,400 vines, and that gets me there. So then you can kind of use that as a place to start and say, okay, well, 8 by 4 is 1,361 vines per acre, 7 by 4 is 1,556 vines per acre. But, you start going to 6 by 4, or, it's 1,815 an acre, but you really only need 1,400 vines per acre to get that 5 pounds per vine. So I think we really need to understand that dynamic better as an industry, and match it better with what the demands are in the market and with what wineries want and where winemakers' expectations are about what we're growing, so that we can lessen that burden on labor, especially with the increased linear footage when we go tighter. As Garrett mentioned, we want to plan for the future, and whether that's mechanization, where you want to have cross arms that are going to fit in the machine. I think that's one of those things that you talk to somebody, a salesperson for a piece of equipment, and they say, oh yeah, it's great, it works for this. But then you go actually talk to people who've used the machine, and you realize, oh, well, no, actually they say it does, but really you want 10-inch cross arms for an over-the-rail harvester, or 12-inch. They say 18, but maybe that doesn't work so well. So those are considerations that I think we need to, share as a community and understand what we can do to improve the mechanization, because I think that that's just the future. We're going to have to incorporate it where we can, and lower the labor hours required per acre on some of the canopy management and fruit work. And that we can do with trellis design and spacing and a lot of different ways. It's just all about doing those calculations and working with your vineyard management company or, you know, whoever you've got as your partner. So I know I kind of breezed through that pretty fast. I'm hoping that there's going to be some questions and we can kind of have a dialogue. I think each site is different. We can go to the last slide. And one thing that, you know, I love about viticulture and being a viticulturist is being able to, you know, go onto a site and understand that that site has a personality and it's going to be different than any other site, you know, and understanding what can I do for that vineyard to represent itself, to show its personality with the least amount of manipulation possible and to find balance in those vines. And each site's going to be different. There's no magic formula. There's no wrong way to do it. There's just better ways that'll match, you know, economic viability of a property or quality targets. But we have a lot of tools in the toolkit, and so, you know, work with your consultants, with your vineyard management company to come up with what makes the most sense for you at your vineyard site. So I hope that was helpful and that you guys got something out of that. And I think we're probably about ready for questions.
Yeah, any questions you guys have, you're welcome to raise your hand or pop them in the Q&A chat box. We did have one, I think, that went into the chat about, can I get the formula for spacing and vines per acre?
Yeah, definitely. So the square footage of 1 acre is 43,560 feet. So 43,560. And all you got to do is take that number divided by your vines times tractor row. So if it's 6 by 4, 6 times 4 is 24. So you do 43,560 divided by 24. It is the most magical formula, you know. If you're going to do crop estimations, harvest, you know, suckering, hours per acre. One interesting thing that I like to mention to people is if you go from 8 by 5 to 7 by 4, that's an increase of 14% in linear footage. And so it's important to know that if you're pruning, or, you know, what costs are going to be like as you change and go tighter and wider. So.
And we can also include that in the follow-up email, that in case you didn't write that down quick enough.
It's a really good point Justin brings up. You know, as we talk about building a vineyard for the future, that row spacing is incredibly important. We need to be thinking about hand labor hours in terms of, you know, sort of hours per linear cordon foot is a great measurement. And yes, we get, you know, 13 to 14% more linear cordon feet. Sometimes that translates directly to more crop as well. So we can think of an increase in crop as being 13 to 14% just by taking that step. But it also means all of our hand labor, the time it takes to get through that per acre is increased as well by a similar amount when we talk about our canopy work and some of our high touch type things. So it's incredibly important to get those understandings out early. As we do a lot of vineyard budgeting, that's one that, you know, tends to get overlooked, is this peak demand of workload in, you know, basically May through June, as we hit kind of our peak of canopy work. The more linear cordon feet we add as an entire valley, the more stress there's going to be on labor at that particular time. So thinking about different strategies to spread that out as your own company or as a management company, getting different types of systems that give you the ability to lessen the overall demand during that peak time is going to make for a much more efficient operation.
We've got some questions coming in. The first one being, can you elaborate on heat mitigation options?
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for that. Obviously, most of the heat mitigation options are things that can be built into an existing vineyard or planned for in a new vineyard. Most of the time, those tend to be water related. So oftentimes we're doing micro sprinklers or mister type systems. Not every property has the water resources for that. And in other cases, we're looking at kind of passive heat control options. And so that's making sure that we get as much shading as possible during peak times during the day. That goes all the way back to our vineyard development, as Justin mentioned. Choosing the right row orientation is the number one thing that we can do to mitigate heat effects. We think about very easy to understand what the wrong row orientation is, and the wrong row orientation is something that puts the fruit in the heat of the day. Basically for more than an hour of direct sunlight is enough to be a problem. So really dialing in your row orientation is the first step, and then add-ons. It's surprisingly not that expensive to be able to add on to a vineyard some sort of misting system, or repurpose your frost control system to work as a heat suppression. There's also shade cloth. We've talked a lot about this in prior seminars, but shade cloth is a really great Band-Aid if you do find yourself with one of those what we consider rough orientations, to be able to keep the direct sunlight off the fruit.
And yeah, the follow-up to that was, what are your thoughts on installing misters in a moderately warm area? Does this mean 3 poly lines?
I can jump into this. We used to, 20 years ago, it was basically just put in one single drip system and, eventually go add an emitter here and an emitter there to really deal with this. Now, by default, we're doing double poly, and more by default, we're setting up for 3 service lines that can basically be a primary irrigation line, a secondary irrigation line that would function like double poly. And then if we do a 3rd service line, being able to run similar flow to a drip system. And that basically allows us to run a variety of different low flow sprinklers and or misters. Water quality is probably the biggest concern when it comes to using traditional mister systems, which would be fine mist and not droplet type stuff. And some of that is not really workable if you have sometimes surface water. Sometimes the cleaning requirements to get to small enough micron size is prohibitive for most vineyards. So in a lot of cases, we're dealing with low flow type sprinklers that would basically mirror 20 gallons per acre kind of rate, similar to a drip system, and could be used as a service line from a 3rd poly and or a valved double poly system.
One more about misters. Misters have a reputation for plugging up maintenance issues. Would proper row orientation and canopy spread have dodged the damage from last fall's 113-degree heat event in your experience?
You want to take that, Justin?
I would say with misters, probably not. If you had rainbirds, overhead frost protection, that can drop that temperature down pretty significantly and create a different environment in terms of humidity. And I think that's what would be needed at those temperatures. But we're talking 55 gallons a minute versus, as Garrett said, a more low pressure system. That's a pretty high water demand in the middle of summer, in August or whenever that's needed. You're fortunate if you've got the water. If you do, it could be effective, but most people aren't capable of doing that.
Yeah, there's certainly, I have plenty of outfits where we've got lots of water at our disposal. And last year we saw 117 degrees as high temps in a lot of places. Keep in mind that berries tend to really hate that high temp. If it's coupled with a very high vapor pressure deficit, so very dry weather, the Labor Day heat that we got is where we saw that 117.5. When I turned on our micro sprinklers in a vineyard on that day, we were able to bring the temperature down 15 degrees, and that's enough to completely save a crop. I have plenty of places where we didn't have the luxury of that, where we lost 30-40% of the crop just due to heat damage on those days. Thankfully, it wasn't as high of a vapor pressure deficit as we've actually seen in prior years. The Labor Day heat was actually a little more humid than we've seen in other vintages, and so the high temperature itself is bad. If you have direct light on the fruit, you can measure the fruit temperature and sometimes be in the 125, 130 degree temperature range. Those are undoubtedly, for a white grape, going to kill the grape, and for most red grapes, if you're not in kind of certain windows of the fruit, will also damage that fruit. So certainly around Brazen, and anytime you're over 22 bricks, tends to be a very sensitive time for that fruit. Back to the water quality issue, using those, if you do have poor water quality, there are variable aperture size things that we can get for different micro sprinkler systems. And it's just worth, looking at somebody who has it successfully, done in their vineyard, or trying just a few different things. Clients that I've worked with, we've had misting systems installed back since the early 2000s, and there's not one perfect system. I wish there was.
Yeah, I guess I should have prefaced that the misting system can work. It's just, does it work when you need it to? I think it's been challenging. Yeah.
All right, another question we have is, can you discuss elements to include in new vineyard developments that incorporate new or future technologies that are in the pipeline, such as automation of irrigation, et cetera?
Yeah, the future-proofed vineyard is one that's kind of a smart vineyard, if we think of it that way. In most cases, that's running from some sort of central weather station, in current type configurations. We have a lot of places where we can automate some of these processes. In most of the time, we like the flexibility to utilize a system like that remotely and just turn it on or turn it off, but not necessarily have it run autonomously. I don't quite see a place for us to take things like irrigation and have it solely controlled by our computer, for example. There's always a human element that we need to be making sure that things are working. Now, the same sort of thing with frost. We have the ability to turn an engine on from 200 miles away if we really want to, but there's comfort in having eyes on what's happening and making sure that it's working. I think building your vineyard for that, having those pieces in place as new technology comes along and becomes add-on, that's something we should really plan for all the time. There are tremendous amounts of new technology. I mean, we're in the farming business, and you don't think of technology being a really important piece of our business. But because we're such a specialized business, there's a lot of attention for new products, some that work, some that don't, that really make to us first. I would always suggest that somebody look at least at some different types of ET sensors, things like that are fairly low cost, that can give you a tremendous amount of data and sort of run on real time. Those are things that I think the average grower should consider putting in as a default at this point.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And there's also a lot of products out there, or tools maybe, that can fill in the gap of one step in a process. So we talk about automation and we think, okay, we're just going to press this button and it's going to go do everything for us. But there are a lot of times where there's one step in 3 or 4 steps that you can eliminate with automation that really helps the process go smoother too, whether it's filling a tank with a float switch and those types of things.
I'll take the question about vineyard management.
I can't see the questions. I'm sorry. Yeah. What's the question?
Was that you, Justin? I mentioned that vineyard management companies are on their own. That was just more tongue in cheek. As we look at, so we have some really fantastic professional companies here. I got started in this industry working for a vineyard management company. And, one of the things that we do here in vineyards in Napa and really started this process is that we've become very specialized with providing labor, providing technical services. These are things that vineyard management companies have been dealing with since their inception. How do we manage labor? How do we look at efficiencies? How do we cover 60 different vineyards that all need the same treatment all the time? Vineyard management companies are highly specialized in this area, and I say I don't have any advice for them, because in a lot of cases they're the people you should be reaching out to get that advice, because they're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. I'll let Justin take this on, but some of the things that he's probably dealing with around challenges coming up here are obviously we need to make sure our clients are certainly profitable. Otherwise, none of us can be in this business. We need to make sure that we have labor availability and opportunities to really work with our workforce, build a stable workforce that can meet these peak demands. And Justin, I'm sure you have a ton more to add to that.
I like what you had said in your presentation about demanding more of a vineyard management company, because I think one of the biggest issues that I run into oftentimes is not having the communication to the point where there is something that a client might want or a grower might want done, but it hasn't been communicated. And if I don't know that, or it's not in the farm plan or part of the budget, then we like to make recommendations, but oftentimes we can do more. That's just that dialogue needs to be there, and we try and be as transparent as possible as cost, so that there's no surprises. You can do more and it costs more. You can do less and it costs less. So there's a whole range there. I can't really see the question. What was the other part of the question?
Well, that was it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, which is great in Napa, is that most of us vineyard management companies really try to work together and help each other out, especially with COVID and what we were expecting to have happen last year. That fortunately we were able to get through part of harvest without too much of a COVID issue. But we're there to support each other, because we all, we're all in it together. Napa is a region together, collective, and we want to lift each other up and share our knowledge in the vineyards. And the vineyard management companies, the viticulturists in the valley, I think, do a really great job of being a community, which I think is really important.
I see one question in the chat, which might, Emily, if we still have time here, please make the argument for growing and or planting white grapes in Napa, Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, other white grapes too, things that you may not hear of, mostly Ribolla Gialla or, something fancy, back to Chenin Blanc. White grapes are a unique animal as we've really transitioned, I think, in the past 30 years or so here in Napa to working kind of exclusively with ultra premium grapes, and cost of everything have gone up. This revenue per acre number, this gross revenue per acre number, is a major factor to include in that discussion. There, if you bought a property tomorrow, it's very hard to make any money growing grapes and not getting 30 grand an acre in gross revenue. It's nearly impossible. And you start thinking about what our pricing is for white grapes in that category, and it's hard to stand out. It's hard to really make that happen. So you do see a lot of properties that have been in, have a low property tax base, have a low, everything about it is paid off, and it might make a lot of sense for a property to increase their white grape amounts from that area. So it's not a perfect situation. What I like to have people think about is grow what you're good at, grow what your site is really good at. In a lot of cases, some properties don't make sense to go to a red grape, and so we're kind of sort of needing to have a white grape, and then we need to look at how do we make that work. And in a lot of cases, there are a tremendous amount of wineries that have their own land as well, and they're looking to maximize their property with Cabernet, and so they're out there shopping for white grapes. Getting ahead of them and being the go-to person for that is the challenge with white grapes, and I think that's something that more and more wineries are looking to purchase outside for that, and really make some spectacular Chardonnays and Sauvignon Blancs. In the end, the bottle price oftentimes drives the revenue per acre that we can really afford when we're buying grapes. And, we should all be working on efforts to make our winery partners successful, so that, we can have a 40 or a 50 or $60 bottle of Chardonnay, which is, allows us to spend a little bit more money on those white grapes, and look to growers to have the right quality. It's not impossible, but it is something that comes with a little bit more challenge than just putting in Cabernet and asking for Napa average or higher. I see another question.
Got a few more if everyone doesn't mind hanging in.
Yeah, labor costs going up 5 to 10% in the next year. Where do we see prices, especially Cabernet Sauvignon, going this year and next? Is there still an oversupply of acreage post fires? Great question. I think.
Yeah. What's your crystal ball say for the Grape Crest report? Come on,
Yeah,
I'm ready.
exactly. I've been avoiding that answer.
That's
Everybody.
February 4th.
Yeah.
I think let's take it backwards. The Grape Crush report, we can pretty much guarantee that Napa Cabernet pricing will go down somehow. The number is just hard to predict. I would hope at this point, wineries and growers may start to use this as an opportunity to look at this, what do I really need for my vineyard? What is an appropriate number? Work backwards from that gross revenue per acre. We know our farming costs generally. We know what we want to spend in a vineyard. We can always anticipate costs going up. I'll let Justin comment on what he's seeing for labor, but what we talked about 4 or 5 years ago with minimum wage going up, not that any of us pay minimum wage, but it has an effect on sort of the overall wage that needs to be paid. And then reduction in overtime hours. We were predicting that there would be anywhere between a 5 to 10% increase in labor costs per year. Now, that's not all vineyard costs. That's only a portion of the vineyard costs. And that's where a lot of growers are looking to soften the edges with some mechanization around that, or in some cases doing a little bit less. I think we need to be cautious, though, about building systems that force us to have on-demand labor for that area. If costs are going to be going up at a pretty steady pace, we need to build that into our cost of goods and or that revenue per acre that we need to be able to sell our fruit for. I think those were all the questions in that one. But Justin, do you have any comments on the?
Yeah, definitely. I think the H2A program has been really beneficial, and it's allowed us the last couple of years to bring down some of those labor costs, which is incredibly important. I do see the wage is leveling off a little bit. It will continue to go up, but not as much as we've seen the last couple of years. And a lot of that is due to the availability of labor from restaurants being closed and hotels being closed and things like that. So I suspect that will change as we go back to things opening again. But currently for this season, I think we're in pretty good shape for that. And then just a bright spot has been the bulk market. I think that's really helped a lot with pricing for, let's just say Napa Cab specifically, but last year we were in quite a surplus, and that tightened up pretty fast over the last few months. And so I think going into the season, there is, I think, good demand for Napa grapes out there, which is really nice to know that we as growers do have a little bit of leverage again with the wineries. So hopefully the pricing will maintain and hold pretty strong, and we won't see too much of a drop in that. But I do think with redevelopment, it's really important to understand the cost per acre and what things are going to be like, especially if you're going from like a 10-foot or 12-foot row spacing to 7-foot. It's a big increase in your cost per acre, and so those are things, and labor hours required. There's definitely things that need to be considered.
I see one question in the chat, Emily. Do you recommend a vineyard management contract be used for things like indemnification? Does NVG have a template contract for that? Great question. We've done a lot of contracting seminars over the years. And so if you look at the resources on the website, there should be some places to point towards that. There are a lot of changes with AB5 and all sorts of other COVID related things. And I mean, the HR portion of our business is taking a very dramatic, steep climb in sort of what we have to look at and make sure we're protected from. So I think that's probably going to be a subject of future discussions, but it is something that at least start there with the NVG resources. And then, I think right now it's such an ever-changing sort of dynamic with all the different rules around hiring and working with third parties that it's worth reaching out to some of our really good lawyer partners, all of which are on our associate list. And I think some of which are sponsoring this today, which we'll see on the other slide. But do take a look at that. There's really great resources for members, and start there, and then it should get you to the right place to ask the right question.
Absolutely. And we've got one last question in the Q&A box. Thoughts on fire mitigation to incorporate into new vineyard developments? What designs worked well in 2020?
Yeah, fire mitigation. This is an interesting one. You know, after 2017, we started looking at really ways to look at our risk around of fire and specifically with smoke taint a little bit differently. The you know, as we look at predictability and climate change, we're always predicting that it will be more variable, if that makes sense. And so looking to, you know, kind of how the insurance industry looks at things, you know, if it was a 1 in 30-year event, we should be thinking of a 2 in 30-year event or a 3 in 30-year event happening to us more frequently. And in those particular cases, it starts to make sense for us to build in permanent infrastructure into the vineyard to help deal with that. And so some of the things we talked about might assist you in that. Some of the overhead sprinklers, the misters, you know, property protection specific things. I have a few vineyards where we installed sprinklers around the perimeter of the vineyard post 17, so that we would just make sure that our vineyard was a fire break. It performed really well as a fire break, but now we're going to add 20 feet away from the vineyard as a fire break too. And so those are the things that we're really good at as farmers. We can be flexible and try to protect key parts of our property. There's a whole nother area that we're starting to evaluate now on smoke taint and smoke taint products to really help reduce that. So let's say that, you know, we get a fire, we can see it coming. We're all looking for products to help us reduce the risk in the field. So is there something that we can spray on our fruit prior to a smoke event to really give us an extra week or 2 or 3 weeks of protection? And I'm happy to say that, you know, we were able to see the fires coming before we got dosed with a lot of smoke and able to evaluate some products this year in a commercial setting. And the jury's still out on whether or not those are going to work or not. But I expect some really, you know, important, you know, tools for that in the vineyard to help us quantify smoke taint risk, and then also have some crop protection tools to also reduce the risk as they make it to the final lines. Most important thing that you can do though is think about what you're growing. If you're a Sauvignon Blanc grower, you have a month, if not a month and a half less of smoke risk than you do as a Cabernet grower. And as we think about as late as we get into the season, every single week we add to our harvest, whether that's getting close to November 1st, the risk of wildfire goes up exponentially. And so a keen eye to farming your vineyard for earlier ripeness is one that gives you flexibility, gives your winery partners flexibility, that when you see a fire start, you can go in and pick it tomorrow and not have to, you know, wait for things to get ripe. That all has to come into play with proper vineyard design. If you don't build a vineyard from the beginning to be ready to be ripe early, it's very hard to make it that way. And so, you know, an eye for looking at this future climate variability, you should be thinking about that as you work on your redevelopment plans.
Right. Well, thank you. There are no additional questions. We appreciate you guys going a little over time to answer everyone's. And with that, we will follow up with the recording of today's webinar. And when you log off again, be sure to fill out the survey. And Justin, Garrett, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. We truly appreciate it. So thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great 2021.
All right. Cheers.
Have a good one, everyone. Thanks.